Hello, beautifuls. You are listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Brooke Thomas, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host, Vanessa Scotto. On the show, we're talking about being on the embodied spiritual path, and what does that actually mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything, all the beauty and crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life? We're attempting to sort that out for ourselves here on the show. So we've had a good number of episodes lately that are about the more challenging emotions, things like grief and despair or heartbreak. And we've really dug into how to feel all the feels, especially those ones that we'd like to avoid, and particularly in our culture that we are pretty avoidant of. A funny thing though, so for all of our happiness chasing, we're actually not exactly whizzes at pointing the compass towards ease or true pleasure either. So the same striving that keeps us chasing happiness keeps us from actually resting into the more delicious and delightful parts of being human. So lest you think we're glorifying suffering, in today's episode, we're talking about navigating towards some of the more yummy parts of life. So leaning into the bliss a little bit more than the grit today. If you're enjoying the show, it would be fantastic. If you wanted to leave a review for us, you can do that on iTunes or on our Facebook page, which is Bliss and Grit. And you can also head over to the website, which is blissandgrit.com, and subscribe there to hear updates on upcoming events. We don't have any official news, but we will certainly be doing something in person this summer. Right now, we're trying to make it for the early part of the summer, but, talking with people about spaces and stuff. So if you subscribe there, you will be able to hear about that just as soon as we know dates and information. One last thing before we head into the conversation, we have potty mouths. We do swear spontaneously. So if you're at work or if there are children around, you might want to wear headphones. Okay, here we go. Hello there.
Good morning.
I had an interaction with one of my clients this week where I found myself giving her the advice. I heard myself saying to her, seek ease and choose pleasure. And then I started kind of laughing to myself on the inside because I said it basically on the day that we were putting out one of our episodes that was like grief and despair. How do you face your own shit? How do you go really face the things? Get in there,
let it be messy.
And I realized I give this advice to people a lot, seek ease, seek pleasure, seek delicious, to use a word from Kieran Trace, our mentor. And I want to make sure that all of our conversations that we're having don't start to glorify suffering, because that's another ego trick that is very common. That we can be glorifying the suffering so much that we forget that we actually want to, not just lean into that new identity. So when this happened with this client, I was talking to her and she was asking me about a particular issue and how she could work with it. And I said, I was giving her the advice, have you tried meditating? And I saw her go, yeah, I know. She's like, I know, you're right. I have to do that. And I was like, oh, no. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying, hey, get it together. Put this other arduous, awful, hateful thing on your to-do list and force yourself to do it and get it right. But it immediately gets taken that way. I was like, oh, no. So the whole game here with meditation is how do we surrender into our lives? And surrender doesn't come from a place of sit up straight, don't have a thought, not having a thought, having a thought, oh, no thought, and have to do it for 30 minutes, timer didn't go off yet. And we've all had those moments in meditation. I certainly have, but how can we set our compass to places that allow us to explore ease, flow? Certainly there are a lot of spiritual traditions that point towards surrendering into flow being the whole enchilada. And how can we experience pleasure and just make sure to catch ourselves that we're not glorifying suffering? It's definitely one of my pain bodies. So I wanted to make sure that we got into that.
Okay, so we're basically going to talk about choosing pleasure and ease. I like it. You know I like it.
Yeah, you're better at it than I am. You've been my guru that way many times.
Oh my God, I am all for delicious and wonderful. And in fact, you spoke about your pain body, let's say historically being prone towards identifying with the suffering. And mine would go in exactly the opposite direction and identify overly much with the pleasure, right? So I guess we have something to teach each other about how we can find the middle path, as Buddha would say. So I think it's interesting. We have to start to talk about paradox, which is really what Bliss and Grit was all about, right? That at the very same moment, we have to hold paradox, bliss and grit, form and formless, levity and gravity, right? All of these things exist at once. So maybe this is a good time to say that what we're really aiming at is that people get to be human, right? Present, free, liberated from any contrived movements, liberated from any habitual addictive patternings that make you reactive or that leave you in a mode where you're trying to control everything, right? So for us to be human means just to show up and be present. And then in that, there is pleasure and there is pain and there is humor and there is seriousness. And, it's just an uncontrived, spontaneous flow, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when do we catch ourselves in those moments where because that's the whole thing, right? Is like awareness, being aware of what our own inclinations and pain bodies are. And so, like you're saying, you have had the awareness of like, oh, I can really identify with this pleasure person or, maybe dissociate from certain things in life by heading over towards pleasure. And I will do it the opposite way where I'm just like, just have to really keep getting comfortable with the fact that life is suffering. And it's like, really? Or do you just keep writing it in a way where that's your underlying assumption?
Mm-hmm.
So catching ourselves is the thing. And I think that moment was so great where I'm like, have you tried meditating? It's like, I know, we've all seen that a million times. And it's like, okay, so there's an assumption. There's an assumption in this negative feeling, which is many things, right? Like, I'm going to hate it. It's going to be hard. It's going to be uncomfortable. I'm not any good at it. I have to do it. I should do it. I should be good at it. It's good for me. It's like all of those things just come in the blink of an eye with that, like, yeah, I need to. So it's catching that moment, and for this conversation, like in particular, disrupting it towards, if you can look at that and see the underlying assumptions, you're automatically more human because you're not just going along with the stories that I have been writing for our whole lives about this. Well, this is the content of my life, like, yeah, got to lean into suffering, got to get good at it, got to strive.
Well, I think that part of what happens is all of those thoughts that you're describing that can pop in a nanosecond, all the judgments and the shame and the feelings and all of the expectations that can just kind of flood in a nanosecond. What they also do is they inhibit us from feeling pleasure. And then they create a certain experience. So then when someone does go to sit down to meditate or goes to try a new exercise or whatever they're about to approach with all of their thoughts flooding their system like that, then they don't experience pleasure doing it. So it does feel like a task. And how do we actually get present? Because, if we were all to just slow down for one moment here and take nice deep breaths, it's like, what doesn't feel good about that? Right? Like, where's the problem here? It's actually a moment by moment situation that is unfolding. I mean, sometimes when I talk to clients, I think that psychology has glorified suffering quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Because we start to associate it with deep thinking, right? Like we start to associate suffering with I'm being real, suffering with I'm not avoiding myself, and suffering with like I'm very clever, I'm very intelligent, I have deep philosophical thoughts about life, right? And the field of psychology has sort of glorified that, and maybe spirituality as well. I don't really know. I'm not really sure. But in the end, it's really just probably a lashback to people not paying attention to simple human things like their feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So then there's this lashback that happens in the culture where it's like, okay, we have to tune in. No one ever talks about the feelings of like pleasure or happiness, though, do they?
No, it's funny. So like we put out our Chasing Happiness episode and talked about how much in our culture we glorify happiness as a goal and happiness as a right. You know?
Yes.
And like it's in our Declaration of Independence. And yet we are also a culture, I would say, that very much glorifies suffering. Or to use another word, striving. And so we're like that perfect dualistic society because we just keep bouncing between the two poles and not finding that like juicy middle ground. All of that space in between the two parts, you know, of the dualism there, that like, I've got to run towards happiness. No, I've got to run towards efforting and doing and making.
Yeah. And don't you think that I think the part about identity is a really important piece that you said before? I mean, we've said it in different episodes, but we can identify with anything, as in this is who I am and this is what life is meant to be like. And when we're that identified with a thought, a belief, a vision of who we are, there is no space to see anything differently. Mm-hmm. So it just feels like the air that you breathe. And sometimes that identity gets formed because you had a family unit in which suffering was the norm. Sometimes it gets formed because your family wouldn't feel any feelings. And so the act of feeling feelings becomes such a rush because you're moving towards truth and you're not hiding anything, right? Mm. But it's funny how our mind bodies can actually segment what feelings are appropriate and what feelings are safe, right? I mean, that's something you and I have spoken about before. If it didn't feel safe for me to feel despair and sadness and grief, you know, I can kind of wall that off in favor of the lighter emotions. And if it wasn't safe for you to feel ecstatic and blissful, you can kind of wall that off. And although sometimes they think about if you were to like try to turn off an emotion, it's sort of like lowering the volume that you can't numb out one, you sort of numb them all out. Mm. While I do see that to be true in part, I notice this kind of segmenting of I'm allowed to experience this emotion because it is considered safe by me or valued by me, and I am not allowed to experience this one. I think that's a lot of what we've been getting at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that we have very little experience and facility with pleasure, like really real pleasure, which, as you said, like when you had to slow down and just breathe a little, like it's totally available. It's very simple. It can get quite large. You know, the feeling can feel quite big. And if we have containers or bodies that are really overbound and, you know, gripping, clenching, and just all those physical dams that we create to every range of feeling that we have, like we can't hold the pleasurable feeling. We can't allow it to move through. Like I'll oftentimes think about a knot tied in a garden hose. Like you can't just turn the water on higher. You have to untie the garden hose, and then it's not about forcefulness of the water. It just flows through because the garden hose is in its appropriate configuration. But I think we really have more experience with some of the like darker emotions of suffering and stuff. And then we think that we're getting pleasure when we're actually getting more striving, because pleasure usually comes in the form of a future goal. In the future, tonight I'm going to have a piece of chocolate cake or go out to that really nice dinner, or that's my dream house. I hope one day I can buy that house, and then I'll experience pleasure. But I think it's this funny, it's just like we really don't understand pleasure as a concept, that it's here right now. It's always available. And it can be, quite somatic. Like the more unbound my body gets, which goes along with my identity getting more and more unbound, like it can just be the most pleasurable thing in the world to just lay on the floor and feel how open my body feels. It's not something I would have experienced in years past. But then also simple things like those moments when you are out in the world and then you come to presence, like witness consciousness, and you're like really there and you're like, like everything's so beautiful. And it was all here the whole time.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
But it is different. I mean, you can experience pleasure in the moment. It's not all striving or future-based
Well,
thinking.
I think pleasure only happens in the moment. We just get confused.
Well, I mean, even in our culture, because it's not just thinking about a chocolate cake tonight, it's like eating a chocolate cake.
Yeah, sure.
Like gluttony has its own association with pleasure. That was really the pleasure I was good at. Not really so much the striving, although let's say thinking about a vacation that was coming would get me, a little enthusiastic or give me something that I was fantasizing about. I love fantasy. But most of my pleasure seeking came from gluttony, right? Like the food I was going to eat right now and like, this chocolate and like, oh, this wine and like, I'm in Napa and, like the sheer decadence of it all. And as like a former pleasure junkie, I see what you're saying, Brooke. I experience it that way. The simple pleasure of now, like being outside and like smelling the air and feeling the breeze. It's so filling. It really is so filling. And I still sometimes miss my gluttonous pleasure.
Well, you're watching your coffee ritual in the morning is like a religious experience. Just being witness to you talking to your coffee as you put it together.
Good morning, coffee.
Good morning, coffee.
You're delicious. I can't wait to drink you. And it's like crazy. Sometimes I look at my life and I'm like, how did I get this boring? Right? Don't you feel that for some people like myself who are pleasure seekers, we're also in a way like a sensation seeker, which is funny because I'm not one for really sensation seeking activities, like let's say jumping out of a plane, which a lot of sensation seekers are. But it is this kind of high level of pleasure stimulus that I'm looking for. Now, maybe that points to my tantric wiring, since the tantric Buddhists and the tantric yogis were very much about pleasure being something workable, something that you can contact direct experience through. It was a state actually to be cultivated. Mm-hmm. So maybe it just kind of points to that. But then we have these misassociations about what's going to create pleasure, right? It's like, oh, there's an Indian saint. His name is Tagore, Tagore. I don't know how to pronounce it right. I'll correct this in the resources if I'm wrong. But he says something about like, the thing is that you're aiming too low with like your pleasures, right? It's like you should want the world and you're aiming too low. And I think that's what's happened to a lot of us in our culture. It's like we can probably differentiate between happiness and pleasure, and that would probably be useful. But we can recognize in some corner of our existence, if not in the vast majority of our existence, that pleasure is just this wonderful thing to have because life is short and it's precious and we should celebrate it. And yet, what we've come to associate as the causes of pleasure, as the bringers of pleasure, is kind of a complicated lot, because there's nothing implicitly wrong with taking a bite of a beautiful, chocolate cake that someone baked and it's got love in it. And, go ahead and take a bite. And why would you not enjoy that? Like, yum. But of course, 10 bites in, 15 bites in, then my stomach hurts and I feel real full and I'm on a sugar crash and I kind of hate myself because I'm like, I can't move. And it actually decreases pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I was discovering, so I did Kieran's Delicious Body course, which it's really, brilliant in the way it's set up, because it starts out the first few weeks where it's just about your relationship with food. And it's that whole principle, right? That it's like, this isn't about your relationship with food. It is, but it's about your relationship to your whole life. Mm-hmm. And food is just the string that we're going to tug to unravel the whole ball of yarn, And one of the pain bodies that I discovered was like, the reason why I am eating, 3 pieces of chocolate cake or whatever, in my darker moments is not because there's a problem with enjoying chocolate cake, and that it's not about pleasure is a problem. The whole reason why I'm overdoing it is because I believe that the window for pleasure is small and I need to get it in while I'm giving myself permission to be out of jail. I'm just not just talking about food. I'm talking about in general in my life, in all categories. And so I'd better enjoy in this little window that I have mentally, unconsciously allotted for myself as the pleasure window, because I know that once I decide time's up, then it's back in jail for me. It's back to feeling the hard feelings and life is hard and long to-do list and, lots of striving and planning. And that was really amazing for me, because now I can see how that pain body, that I had better get my moment of pleasure in this tiny window that I've given for myself because it's going to close, how that rules every category of my life. It's so fascinating. And so pleasure is not the overdoing it. Like, this is where we have to get in to that place in our bodies, get into the actual experience, the moment by moment experience of chocolate cake. And then when does the tipping point happen? It's very tricky to catch, where the stories start. Oh my God, this tastes so good. Oh my God, I don't get to have enough pleasure in my life. I better hurry up and eat this, because once the piece is gone, I'm not going to let myself have another piece. So, and when is the next time that I get to have pleasure? And I don't know, it's like all those things that are just running, total white noise that we just miss. We skip it.
Yeah, it's so loaded, and then it's so unsatiating. Like, you get it all in and it means nothing afterwards.
Yeah, and you never are satiated by food, by work, by friendships, by sex, by whatever. Like, you're not ever allowing yourself to take it in. Yeah. You're just toggling all this, managing all the stories completely below the level of conscious awareness.
Yeah, what I like about the story that you just told is, I'm not sure exactly what my story would be on why I was such a glutton, but I know it's not that.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
I know it's not
so
that
nuanced and individual, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, you just can't have a broad stroke with all of this kind of stuff. That's why it's like, I don't like rules, generally speaking.
Amen.
When soon as it's like, don't eat this and don't do that and don't, okay, whatever you do, you've done this once. Okay, let's say, for example, let's say you fell in love and you always fall in love so fast, Brooke, within 3 weeks you're in love and you've done it every time and it's never quite gone right. So now you're single again and then you're like, I'm not going to fall in love within 3 weeks because that's never gone right. And I'm like, that's not really what I would advise.
Right.
What I would advise is to be human and present and responsive to your environment. And that's what freedom is. Freedom isn't following some kind of mandate that you construct from your ego consciousness about, okay, now this will keep me safe, or this will bring me more pleasure, or this is the path. It's really about being clear enough and present enough to discern for yourself, literally moment by moment, where you're at. So when we start to talk about these stories around pleasure and these stories around what you get and all of these kinds of things, the big problem is that they create this idea that there's some specific way to move. Like, okay, so then the answer for Brooke is, she should have chocolate every day so she never feels like the window of pleasure is so small.
Right. We could just as easily go that route. Yeah.
Right.
Pile in the pleasure.
A coach may do. That's what a good old fashioned life coach could do. And it's like, well, that's not necessarily solving anything. And it's not letting her go like, today, do I want this? Maybe tomorrow I don't. And where's this movement coming from? Because our intentionality is so much the point of everything. I mean, everything. Like, love is always a beautiful thing, right? But if I treat someone with so much love and affection to get them to love me, I'm in a corrupted pattern.
Yeah. And corrupted patterns always breed corruptness. I'm not going to start talking about the government.
Yes.
I'm not going to do it.
We are not talking about that level of corruption. Just when we do good things. So now I'm remembering as we're talking, we spoke a while back. I don't remember what the episode was. It was something about suppressing bliss, but we were talking about this Italian psychologist. His name was Assagioli, who talked about the suppression of the sublime and how people can do that. And I remember one of my mentors, my psychology mentors, her name was Stella Resnick. She was the best. She was in her 60s. She was a sex therapist. And she had studied Gestalt psychology with Fritz Perls, who I don't know if you know, but he's the founder and he was the bomb. And Stella was like so sexy and pleasure filled and, wonderful to be around. And she was a psychoanalyst too. And she used to talk about how, people would go to therapy, and if all you ever do is talk about your problems, then all you ever learn how to get good at is looking at problems. And that's very different than learning how to feel pleasure and happiness and joy and contentment in life. And, she would balk at how the psychological industry sort of focused on one aspect, which, is a very important aspect. And thank God we did. You and I have had a ton of healing that way. I still, of course, value it. But that there was this big thing missing. Like, could you talk about your pleasure with someone? That's very intimate.
Yeah. Or I even remember when we would listen to Dharma Ocean recordings of meditations, and they're recorded live at retreats. You know what I'm going to say. And you would always, you would be going through the meditation, and then you'd hear in the room somebody start to break down in tears. No, don't even go there. Okay, no private jokes on air.
No, we will talk about it.
Okay, we will sometime.
After.
But, you'd hear somebody start to break down in tears, like they're meditating and they have some kind of breakthrough that moves them to tears, like sobbing, kind of sad tears, like wailing kind of tears, not just rolling down the cheeks, gladness tears. And I remember listening, and what I would discover and what I still discover in retreat is I come up against all the dark emotions for sure. But a lot of times what I access when I have my when a big veil is lifted, it's hilarious. It's just fucking so funny. It is so funny that I had been operating under some assumption, which that soap bubble just popped, and it just seems ridiculous to me that I ever thought it was true. And I was like, God, I remember listening to all those recordings and being like, it is so okay and valued that somebody would burst into sobbing, upset, wailing tears in the middle of a meditation retreat. But I bet if I was on my cushion and I burst out laughing, I mean, it's Dharma Ocean, people would hold space for that. But I bet there would be more of a in the room, I'm saying, people yeah. It's a little more assumed you're going to go the route of oh my God, big feeling. which is fine. But we really have this bias, and I do see it in spiritual circles a lot too, where we we assume we're going to go into the darkness all the time.
Well, yeah, remember when we were at the Dharma Ocean Retreat and I was meditating? It was the pure awareness exercise where the guy fainted, that one.
Oh, God, yeah.
That was terrifying. And like 2 minutes before the guy fainted, I had an image of Chogyam Trungpa throwing the ball at my head saying, "Surprise, bitch."
That's right. Surprise, bitch.
Surprise, bitch.
And then down goes one of our retreat mates.
Yeah. So, my, a lot of my meditations do have humor, actually. I mean, when I see Chogyam Trungpa, it's always funny.
Yeah, totally.
At the same time, I have cried deeply. I've had deep visuals. It's really that it's life, right? It's exquisitely unexpected. That's what's lovely. And you're right. People would definitely look askew, especially all the Boulder Coloradians out there. If you were
we love you, and also what we're talking about.
You know how serious Naropa's processing levels can be. And, if you were to laugh during a meditation, I mean, that they'd be like, "What is happening, you maniac?" And though, that's the other thing. So I'm going to share that story. I mean, when you're sitting there and we were doing some of the meditations, it was downright orgasmic for people. Mm-hmm. And some people were breaking through with, and that was embarrassing for me, Brooke. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to make that sound out loud. I do think that there is still, as I said before, a lot of intimacy involved in pleasure.
Yeah.
And maybe it's part of why the tantric practitioners would work with it, because it's such an opening. I mean, if you genuinely were to surrender in pleasure, not like stuff a chocolate cake in your face because you feel like you're never going to get it again.
Because that's not pleasure. That's black hole.
Yes. Yes, that's grabby hands.
Yeah. To use common parlance.
Yes.
It's grabby hands.
That's grabby hands. Instead, if you were to really immerse like cellularly in pleasure, it would open you up. I mean, you lose contact with your own boundary, right? All of a sudden, oneness becomes a real possibility. It becomes a lived experience. It's like how, they always say that the French call orgasm le petit mort, like the little death. Mm. And why? It's because there's this moment of complete surrender where your ego can let go. There's very few moments where your control tower lets go. Mm-hmm. And I think, what the tantric practitioners were doing, because they did historically work with sex. They don't do that so much now. And I hate that our lineage of Tantra has an association with just like how to have good sex.
Right,
that was,
for 12 hours or whatever the fuck.
Oh my God. I mean, that's good. I am not upset about that, but that was never what it was about. But they did use sexuality as part of it. And it's because they were working on their energy channels, actually, like opening certain blockages. And because there was this cosmic surrender where people could feel at one. Really, it's that loosening. So real pleasure, real bliss, real ecstasy. We talked about ecstasy in the past being, it's like, it comes from the Greek root ekstasis. It means like standing outside of oneself. All of these states, when you experience them, they are a surrender. They are a complete opening. It's like uncontrived, and you don't even know what you're going to say anymore. And you have to just kind of trust something as it's unfolding if you let go like that. And that's a place that most people don't feel safe entering. So, right, no wonder we're taking the cheap thrills.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, good sex requires total surrender. That's why it's such a good teacher.
Yeah, not always so easy.
No, totally not. In the way that all of these things are at least unfamiliar turf, our learning edge for most of us. And so what I like about this, because we've talked about, pleasure we start with the title of our show starts with bliss, we're into this. But like going back to our recent episodes on grief and despair and on chasing happiness, the advice, I'm using air quotes, but the input would be the same, which is to go down and in, so like for me, if I'm experiencing a big unpleasant emotion, like a big heartache or something, or a big concern, like I came home from a school conference the other day and I was having heartache over the way one of my son's classmates is treating my son. Try not to talk about him too much, but I was having a little heartache over that. And it's like, it's the same, I meditate. I've spent a lot of time being able to feel my body from the inside. So at least, I've done that work where that's a familiar route to go. And I just feel it. I just feel the heartache. I just feel what it's like in my system. And then for pleasure and bliss and navigating in the direction of ease, it's the same thing. It's go down and in and feel in my system. And like if I'm having a big bliss feeling, it's the same. It's like I have to make space for it. Like a literal unbinding, like fascial unbinding makes space and create the opportunity for my awareness to interact with it and to go over and say, hello, so it's same. It's not that we're talking about two different things.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Hello.
I always tell this story to my Rolfing clients. I had this great Brazilian Rolfing teacher who would talk to the tissue while she worked on people, and only she could get away with it because she was like wearing these charming long skirts and she had this Brazilian accent. Hello, tissue. It's okay. I'll be right here. I wait for you. I was like, yeah, I could not pull that off, but you were totally pulling it off.
You sound so cute when you imitate her. I like it a lot. I do, did you ever read that book, The Buddha's Brain?
No.
Rick Hansen?
Mm-mm.
Well, it's just the neuroscience aspect of how you could start to work with some of these Buddhist practices and Buddhist ideologies. And one of the things he was talking about is drinking in the good. And this comes up in other aspects of psychology. There's a whole tradition called savoring. But basically, apparently, we're quite poor at allowing the goodness to penetrate on a deep level.
Mm-hmm.
Letting it in neurobiologically, letting it into the cells, letting it into the tissues. And there's a lot of recommendation about how you have to kind of really slow down and savor to let it penetrate. And one of the simplest ways I see this is see how you respond when someone gives you a compliment.
Yeah, that's a good one.
It's so simple. It's such a clear identifier. How fast do you try to let that roll off? Like, oh, but it's not, or, oh, it's not me. Oh, thank you. And you'll see that you rarely let those words and the goodness that those words can really invite, because if it's a genuine compliment, it's coming with a loving energy. How quickly you can let those roll away instead of receiving and drinking in the good. And many people, I get the sense that many people who are listening to the show in some way, shape, or form are out there in the world trying to contribute, trying to do good, trying to lend a helping hand to someone. And a lot of times people who do that are often really poor at receiving. And part of being poor at receiving is drinking in good. Another thing could be intimacy issues, but it's just like letting that penetrate. And so I think it's a good place to start to practice. If any of you feel pleasure deficient, it's like even as you take that bite of something sumptuous, coconut chia seed pudding or chocolate cake, or your coffee in the morning. And it's like really going very slow and mindfully and like letting it penetrate your taste buds and then warm your body and then feeling it in your belly and like what does it invite in your body and like does it actually feel good? Does it feel like ease or does your body actually not want it when you slow down? Like so that's a practice you can begin to work with pleasure. You can do the same when someone gives you a compliment. Just can I take a breath and like let that energy in? So I think it's a good practice because we spoke about this in an earlier episode, but many of us feel taboo around receiving goodness and contacting it in a deep way. And I think the other piece, Brooke, I wonder if you're experiencing this now, because you and I can also get prone to mania. And I sort of associate this with my own kind of tendency, is that sometimes pleasure strikes me so strongly. Like I'm on a walk and the air is just right and the trees are so beautiful. Like those are my walking companions. I do talk to trees. Hashtag.
Hashtag talk to the trees.
Talk to trees. Crazy lady that walks around the neighborhood touching them and hoping no one sees.
You have to do it in a Brazilian accent next time. Hello, trees.
Hello, trees. You're so beautiful.
I see you.
Oh, I will. They'll love it. So I'm walking around and, like the pleasure is, the openness is just kind of like mounting in my system. And I swear, all of a sudden, I just want to fall on my knees.
Yeah.
From the beauty of it all.
Yes.
Like weep and literally get on my knees. And then I hold myself back because it's not socially appropriate.
Right.
So pleasure is this thing, right? If you were to fully open to the bliss that is this world, the bliss that's in your body, as you unwind some of these kinks in the hose, as you were describing, Brooke, like I do find you feel ecstasy at some of the more simple things.
Yeah.
It's so available. And if you were to allow that all of the time, I guess for me, my worry is I'll be a fucking crazy lady, that crazy lady who's like at the foot of a tree weeping because it's so beautiful.
And some of the time you will, but I'll speak for myself. Like I'm trying to figure out how to embody these things. Like how do I have enough space for this relatively new thing? Like I can have as much pleasure I want and it's available all the time. Well, what? And so there are these moments where you unkink a portion of the hose and it just fresh water rushes through and it's that like fall on the ground, tears rolling down your cheeks. Like that really happens, guys. It's not just some crazy story you've read in spiritual books somewhere. It happens genuinely sometimes. But I think as it becomes more embodied, more familiar, you have more space for it, you have fewer kinks in the hose, that I would imagine, I don't know yet, but I would imagine there's less of the becoming the person who's just weeping at the base of a tree for 10 years. I don't know.
I don't know.
We'll see.
I'll tell you. But the image I got when you were just talking about like the flooding coming as you unkink the hose was like, you ever have that experience where you're ridiculously thirsty or something, and then when you first have water, it almost hurts a little?
Yes. And you just still feel ridiculously thirsty, like you just can't get enough. Yeah.
Yes. And it's like it cracks in your throat. And it's like if for some reason our system's been deprived of this deep, simple state of goodness, basic goodness, as Chogyam Trungpa would call it, then I imagine as it's coming in, it's like it's a little gristly, it's a little painful. We're so thirsty, and so we have to, strangely enough, be really kind with ourselves around learning to receive and open to all of this goodness. And also, I think it's why Kieran uses the word ease a lot, right?
Yeah.
Like, have you heard her use the word pleasure a lot? Does she talk about that in The Delicious Body?
Yes. I'm trying to think if pleasure is the actual word, because certainly delicious is her word. Delicious is also her nickname, which is totally appropriate. And being with her, I just have to say this. My friend Christina coined this. Did you ever see that Woody Allen movie where, I don't know, they're like on another planet or whatever, and the way they have sex is they hold on to this sex ball, the orgasmatron or something?
Oh, yeah.
Do you see that? And they just hold on to it and they're like, they don't want to let go. He doesn't want to let go, Woody Allen, of the orgasmatron ball.
Yeah.
Hugging Kieran's a little bit like that.
You're like, no,
it's like sex ball, the orgasmatron. So she's somebody who really inhabits delicious. And, one of the helpful meditations is just to be in the presence of people who can It's helpful. Like our systems do resonate like playing music with somebody, it's helpful.
Well, and it'll feel safer because, if everybody's doing it, there's this welcome invitation to step into it.
Yeah.
You don't have to live in that other part that you formerly assumed for safety.
Or even, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's not that important. I was just saying, I think that the word pleasure did get a little corrupted in our culture.
It did. Because it's usually attached to addictions and running
and gluttony and addictions and fleeting states. Like, how they talk about like hedonism, and then they talk about eudaimonia, and there's like, the happiness one could get from meaning versus the happiness one could get from really these material objects. And pleasure is really, if we were to study positive psychology, they would say pleasure is like the lowest form. It's like the, because pleasure implies that temporality. Like it really is like, oh, I'm getting a massage and it feels good, or I'm having cake and yum or sex, but that these are all kind of fleeting things. And so I think culturally that's been the energy of the word itself. So maybe just as we're, coming to the end, talking about like, what do you really mean by pleasure when you're saying pleasure?
Yeah, I mean more that fundamental nourishing goodness, not a thing out there, the cake, but more the ability to open your system and like feel really good, like foundational, fundamental good, and taking pleasure in what is actually happening. So not only the things we label as pleasurable, like sex, but like whatever is happening in the moment, the way the light's coming through the window, so that kind of basic frame of seeing the world as good, that there's goodness here and available all the time, and that we can be receptive to it. We can fill up on it.
That like Buddhist idea that we were born pure. Mm-hmm. And I always loved that idea so much because it was medicine for me. I think I had immersed myself in the Judeo-Christian kind of idea, or at least Christian idea, that we were born with sin. And this idea that we were born pure, Chogyam Trungpa takes that and he talks about it as just basic goodness. That everybody has a basic goodness. It's like this very simple goodness of trees. It's nothing complicated. It's like, he'd even be like a burrito has basic goodness. Like there's just basic goodness. And I think the trance of unworthiness and the ideas that we're not basically good and that life's not basically implicitly good, are some of the stumbling blocks to us just immersing in the kind of pleasure that you're talking about, this sort of fundamental deliciousness. And I know that's why Kieran uses that word, is because it's visceral, it's embodied.
Right.
That kind of fundamental ease and yesness. It's like the only reason why we're not feeling that on a regular basis, if you're not feeling that on a regular basis, is because we don't yet see that we are loved, we are good, we are implicitly right, that the world is a space that has loving energy and implicit goodness swirling into everything. It's very easy to look around the world and see the grit. Mm-hmm. I think most people spend their time trying not to.
Yeah.
But somehow we don't always seem to contact that basicness.
So I might start a tradition here of ending every episode with a new t-shirt idea. And this one is even burritos have basic goodness. That's our next in the t-shirt line.
You're like an enigma wrapped in a burrito shell, Brooke.
But with basic goodness, so.
But definitely full of basic goodness. I mean, for crying out loud.
Thank you so much for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any resources we mentioned, live at blissandgrit.com. You'll see each episode in its own post, and the resources are within those posts. You can also come chat with us on social media. We're at Instagram and Facebook as Bliss and Grit, and we do respond pretty quickly, so it's a good way to get in touch with us. If you want to support the show, you can write us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or on our Facebook page, which again is Bliss and Grit. And we also have a new subscribe form on the website where you can sign up if you want to stay in touch with what we have brewing for the community. We definitely are doing something in person. I hate saying the word definitely because then I feel like I'm in trouble. We are really doing our very, very best to make something in person happen this summer, hopefully on the front end of the summer. We so love hearing from all of you, so thank you to all of you who have written reviews already. That has been a lovely way to get to know people and just to hear how we're doing and how the show is resonating in people's lives. So here's one from Juliana in Tasmania. This is a beautiful, sincere exploration of embodied spirituality. Brooke and Vanessa are so honest, it's a gift to listen to them describe their real-life processes and practices for living a more present, fully human life. If you enjoy listening to real people who are funny, down-to-earth, and extremely generous in their vulnerability, listen up. What a treat. Thank you so much for that, Juliana, and thanks to all of you for listening. We'll be back next week.